Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming to this evening. Before we begin, I just wanted to say a few words on behalf of the Students' Guild, as this is actually the official launch of Research Uncovered 2014-15. For those of you who may not know who I am, I'm Ben Street, and I'm the Vice President Education in the Exeter Students' Guild, and I'm delighted to be opening this year's Research Uncovered project. Research Uncovered was an initiative launched last year and aims essentially at increasing awareness, access and engagement with the research environment here at Exeter. It is essentially an ideas forum. It's a series of interdisciplinary lectures that will be happening throughout this term and next term, given by the world-leading academics at Exeter. It's a project which ties firmly in with the university's education strategy, which, as one of its aims, has to enable every student to learn with the creators of world-leading research. As well as striving to open up access and awareness of research, it also looks at increasing student engagement with research. All of this year's speakers who will be presenting throughout Term 2 were nominated and voted by our students. Levels of engagement with the process have been at a record high, with over 1,000 students getting involved and over 200 academics at the university being nominated. Before we move on to our speaker tonight, however, there are a number of thank yous that I'd like to say. Firstly, to our project sponsors for this evening, the University of Exeter Annual Fund, who have very, very kindly offered to sponsor this project for the next 3 years. To Nick Kay, our Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Education, for his personal support and guidance as our project sponsor. I'd also like to say a massive thanks to various members of the Guild, our wonderful comms team for their design work, our wonderful website design team, and the Research Uncovered website we really do hope becomes a hub for ideas and research which we'd like you all to engage with. Our academic reps who have been really pushing the nominations and voting, to the wonderful XTV who are filming this evening's event, and to my wonderful colleagues in academic representation, in particular David Woolley, who has put a huge amount of effort into this project this evening. But finally, I'd like to move on to our wonderful speaker for tonight. It is with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce Michelle Ryan, the newly appointed Dean of Research at the University of Exeter, to open Research Uncovered this evening. Michelle is a professor of social and organisational psychology here at Exeter, and her research on women's ambition has been widely acclaimed and has received international recognition, including the New York Times and the Times Higher Education Supplement. So, without further ado, I'd like to present to you with Professor Michelle Ryan and officially launch this year's Research Uncovered. I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Ben. That's a wonderful introduction, and it's fantastic to actually be here and be able to actually kick off this fantastic event. So what I'd really like to do is sort of take you through a tour of the kind of last decade's worth of research that I've done, really looking at women and women's ambition, and looking at the types of leadership positions women take on as well. So hopefully I'll talk for about 40-45 minutes, and I'll leave heaps of time at the end for questions and comments, or for you to throw rotten fruit or whatever it is that you want to do. So what I really want to try and get out of this sort of next hour is a bit of a better understanding of women's ambition and how they might strive for the top, whether they might strive for the top, why they might strive for the top, or why they might not as well. So I've started off with this picture here, which is, I guess it's a picture from the sort of late 50s, early 60s. It's sort of very Mad Men-esque. It's of a boardroom. You know, they've got the glasses and the suits and all of those sorts of things. And I think what's really interesting is that the boardroom today hasn't really changed that much. There are very few women at the top, and I guess my research really tries to uncover why that is. I mean, research is never an individual endeavour, it's always done in collaboration with other people, so just thanks to some of my close colleagues, Alex Haslam, Kim Peters and Clara Coolidge as well. So I guess where I'd really like to start is with the idea of the glass ceiling. Hopefully everyone's heard of that. This is the idea that women get to a certain point within the workplace or within politics or with some sort of career ladder, but they tend to be underrepresented in the really top upper echelons, at the top management positions, at the most senior decision-making roles. And I think what's been really interesting is that, I guess, for the most part, over the last 50 years or so, research and also media attention, social commentary and these sorts of things have really concentrated on the barriers that women tend to face as they climb up the ladder. The idea of the glass ceiling. What things do they confront as they go up, and how does it make them difficult to take on leadership roles? But I think that what's been really interesting is that there's been a real shift in focus from this idea of what the barriers are, what are the difficulties that are out there, to this change of spotlight, a change of focus, to look at the large percentage of women who are choosing to leave high-powered jobs. And the rhetoric is really interesting, and it's really moved away from this idea of external barriers that are out there to looking at the decisions that women themselves make. Now, this is very much comes across from, I guess, work by, say, Erin Callan, who in the Boston Globe said things like, well, she was a top CEO in a Fortune 500 company, and she said, well, many women with top degrees, they stay at home. They don't want to go to work anymore. And she said that these decisions show a degree of security. So it's not that there are great women who are out there that are striving for the top and that they can't get there, but the reason that they're not there is because they don't want to be there. The New York Times about 10 years ago ran an article in their magazine that made a very, very similar claim. Don't worry, I'm going to start to interrogate some of this later. But the New York Times asked the question, why don't women make it to the top? And their answer was, because they choose not to. So the New York Times interviewed a whole series of women who had excellent degrees, who had started off in the workplace and really raced up the career ladder, started to take on middle management and then senior management positions, but then dropped out, weren't striving for the very, very top positions, weren't making it into the very top positions. And their claim in this article was that women are no longer willing to make the sacrifices necessary to make it to the top. They interviewed one woman who said, I don't want that kind of life. I don't want those kinds of sacrifices. A baby provides a graceful exit. Now, I don't know how many of you in the audience have had a baby. Graceful is not a word that I would associate with that. But anyway, you can see what they're saying here. So you've got Erin Callan saying deciding not to make it to the top shows a sense of security. You've got the New York Times saying that women are kind of opting out, and they called it an opt-out revolution, whereas these really bright, well-educated, successful women are deciding that they want a better work-life balance, are deciding that they don't want to make these huge sacrifices that are necessary to make it to the top of these companies as well. So that they're kind of rejecting the workplace, voluntarily leaving full-time employment. I think what's really, really interesting about these sorts of comments, the idea that it's not that the workplace has failed women in that there are these glass ceilings, that there are these barriers and all of these sorts of things, but it's also that women are rejecting the workplace. These women look up at the top and are increasingly deciding that they don't want to do what it takes to get there. Now, I think on the one hand, it's great that the New York Times interviews women, asks about their opinions, asks about their decisions. But one thing I worry about the sort of rhetoric that's coming out here, this idea that there are no barriers anymore, it's just that women are opting out because they don't want it, it sets up a really uncomfortable, I guess, idea for me that women aren't at the top just because they don't want to be there. There's no problem anymore, we can just let it lie. And for me, I just don't think it's quite as simple as that. Don't know whether people have heard of Larry Summers, who was then the president of Harvard, who made a comment that fits very much in line with this opt-out revolution, with what Erin Callan is saying. He gave a speech to a graduating class that was talking about why women are underrepresented in the top of mathematics and science as well. And this is a quote from him, then president of Harvard. The most prestigious activities in our society expect of people in leadership positions near total commitment to their work. And it is a fact about our society that this is a level of commitment that a much higher fraction of married men have been historically prepared to make than of married women. So again, this idea, there's leadership positions out there, women just aren't prepared to make the sacrifices. They're just not prepared to be committed enough. So I said that he was then the president of Harvard, no longer the president of Harvard after making these comments. He was forced to resign because of it. But you can see you've got Larry Summers, you've got Erin Callan, you've got the New York Times Magazine, all making these very, very similar claims that women aren't committed, that they're not ambitious, that they're not willing to make sacrifices, and that these are the reasons why they're not in the top leadership positions these days. So what I'd really like to do over the rest of this talk is to sort of ask this idea, is this the case that women lack ambition? Is this why they're underrepresented at the top? Certainly if you look at some of the research out there, there's some evidence that women might express lower levels of ambition. Female business students have lower management motivation in general. Women tend to express lower ambition to climb the ladder if you just do a broad survey of the general public. In a study of Fortune 500 companies, and when you're looking at the proportions of men and women who are leaving management positions, women are almost twice as likely to leave than men. And in a study of UK retail companies, 40% of women who are on the boards of directors, so that, you know, these are very, very senior women, said that they held themselves back from taking CEO positions. So there's some evidence out there, perhaps, that women might be less motivated, less committed, less ambitious, less willing to make these sorts of sacrifices. But I guess in some ways what we have to get to the crux of, what we have to really find out is, are they kind of innately less ambitious? Or what might be preventing them from expressing ambition as well? So as I alluded to before, I think there's a real danger that this emphasis on women's choices, on what they might decide to do or not to do, while I think it's very useful to ask women why they're making their decisions, why we have to think of them as, I guess, active, agentic beings that are not just prevented from taking on positions, but might make decisions about that themselves. I think that if we only focus on, I guess, women's decisions and kind of take them at face value in this way, we might be downplaying the importance of structural barriers, that we might not be looking at the context in which these women make these decisions. So what I'd like to argue over the rest of this talk is that women's decisions to leave organisations, I think, has very, very little to do with the fact that they're unable to cope or that they have different priorities from men. But I'm going to argue that there are differential experiences in the workplace that might actually lead women to opt out of organisational life, not just because they want the graceful exit of a baby or they're unwilling to make sacrifices, but why are they unwilling to make sacrifices? So I'm going to talk about 3 different strands of research that I've been doing since I've been here at Exeter for the last 11 years. Not quite sure how it became 11 years all of a sudden. But I'm going to talk about precarious leadership positions, the glass cliff. I'm going to talk about some work that we've done on the gender wage gap, and I'm also going to talk about work on identity and belonging and a lack of fit. And I'm going to try and weave these 3 strands of research together to try and understand why women might be unwilling to make sacrifices, why they might be reluctant to express ambition, why they might be less committed and less motivated within organisations. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the glass cliff. Has anybody heard of this before? Glass ceiling you've heard of, right? Anybody heard of the glass cliff? No. Okay, let me take you there then. So when I first arrived at the university, sorry for all the people that are filming, I'm just going to walk around. So when I first arrived at Exeter, it was 10, 11 years ago now. I started here as a postdoc, and I was the token gender person in the psychology department. So, you know, there's always one. They're the one that does the psychology of gender lecture or the sociology of gender or education and gender. There's always one in a department, and that was me. And someone put this article in my pigeonhole. One of my colleagues, I guess, I don't know who it was, but I thank them because it certainly started a decade worth of research. And it was from the front page of the business section of the Times back in 2003. So when I first looked at it, I thought it was going to be a kind of positive, upbeat story about women, you know, smashing through the glass ceiling. She's there with her business suit. She's got a sledgehammer. It says at the top, smashing through the glass ceiling. But when you kind of look in more detail at the article, it's not a positive, upbeat story at all. So here's a quote from the article. "So much for smashing the glass ceiling and using their unique skills to enhance the performance of Britain's biggest companies. The triumphant march of women into the country's boardrooms has instead wreaked havoc on companies' performance." Big statement. Not one of the tabloids, front page, business section of the Time. Women are wreaking havoc. So what sort of evidence is there? Every year, the Cranfield School of Management puts out a female FTSE index where they take the top 100 companies on the London Stock Exchange and essentially rank them for the proportion of women on their boards of directors. So those at the top have the most women on boards, and those at the bottom have the least women on boards. And in fact, generally, the bottom 5 also have no women on their boards of directors at all. But what this journalist, Elizabeth Judge, had done is look at the relationship or the relationship, I guess, between the number of women on boards of directors and their actual performance. So what was the average annual share price of these companies? And what she found is that of the top 10 companies, so these are companies with the most women on their boards of directors, 6 of them were underperforming. So the average annual share price was lower than to be expected from the average FTSE 100 company. But all of the bottom 5 companies, so these are companies with no women on their boards of directors, they were all overperforming. So they had better than average, better than to be expected annual share prices. So what was the conclusion then? Corporate Britain would be better off without women on board. So shocking, not a tabloid, it's not the Daily Mail saying this. This is front page of the business section of the Times saying that we just shouldn't have women on our boards of directors. So I guess the great thing about being a social scientist, about being a researcher, is instead of just throwing the newspaper across the breakfast table in disgust, you can actually generate about a year, about 10 years worth of research on this topic. So I guess one of the things we wanted to do is say, well, how much journalistic license is there? We all know what journalists are like. They like to have a big whiz-bang story. They like to be a little bit controversial. But how much real evidence is there for this idea that women are wreaking havoc? So one of the first things we did was, instead of just looking at the top 10 and the bottom 5, we looked at all 100 companies, and we just looked at a simple correlation between proportion of women on boards of directors and company performance. And what we found was essentially a marginally significant, so almost important, relationship between the two. So the more women there were on boards of directors, the worse that company tended to do. So there might be a little bit of evidence there for their claim. But for those of you that study within the social sciences, the first thing that you would have learnt in Psychology 101 or in Stats 101 is that correlation is not causation. If you've got 2 things that are associated with it, you don't know what is causing what. You can't with certainty say that one thing is causing the other. But that's what the Times is doing. They're saying women cause poor company performance. And I guess our question was, can we mix that up a bit? If it's a correlation, could we actually reverse it and come up with a different explanation? Hello? Or come up with a different explanation. Perhaps women only get given senior positions when companies are doing poorly. So rather than women causing poor company performance, perhaps poor company performance causes women to be appointed to boards of directors. So you get exactly the same association, really different story, really different headline. So one of the first things we wanted to do is say, well, can we find any evidence? This is an empirical question in some ways. Is there any evidence that there is some sort of reverse causality going on? So in order to do that, we did some in-depth archival research. Now, one of the first things that we wanted to do is that instead of just looking at average annual share price, which is, I mean, I'm no economist, but I'm assuming that that's a pretty rough estimate of company performance, we decided to look at relative company performance. What we wanted to do is look at how share price goes up and down throughout the year, from month to month. So still not particularly detailed, but much more nuanced than the Times looked at. So we looked at a percentage of increase or decrease from the previous month. The other thing that we wanted to do was actually look at the appointment of men and women to boards of directors. So if a woman's been on a board of directors for 20 years and all of a sudden the share price goes down, it's pretty harsh to blame her, isn't it? So we wanted to really test what happens when women are appointed, this triumphant march of women into the country's boardrooms. What happens before? What happens afterwards? So there were 19 women appointed to boards of directors in these FTSE 100 companies. So this line here, the vertical line, is when they were appointed. We got a matched sample of male appointees, similar companies, similar sizes, similar sectors, similar times, matched on as many dimensions as we could. 19 men, 19 women, and then we can look what happens before and what happens after, and anything above the line is an increase in share price, anything below the line is a decrease in share price. Everyone with me? Okay, so this is men. What we get is actually no real discernible pattern. Certainly this side of the graph, before their appointment, it just goes up and down, and that's what share price does. And these are in very, very different companies at very different times. So actually it goes up 2%, down 4%, down another 2, but then up another 3, down another 1. Just goes up and down. Then the men are appointed, and it tends to go up afterwards. And actually that's quite common. Once you make a change on your boards of directors, you tend to get an increase in share price. Okay, what happens when women are appointed? What you find, and I'm just going to concentrate on this side of the graph at the moment, is that before women are appointed to these boards of directors of FTSE 100 companies, you get this really consistent pattern of poor company performance. So it drops 4%, another 6%, another 4%, and then another 5%. So if I was actually plotting share price, it would be plummeting down like this. Then they're appointed, afterwards it starts to go up, just the same as men. So contrary to the times then, we've got this idea that perhaps women aren't wreaking havoc, they're not causing poor company performance, but rather there's evidence for reverse causality. Extending the metaphor of the glass ceiling, because we think every research project needs some sort of sexy metaphor, the glass ceiling's tended to work for people, we argue that women are more likely than men to confront a glass cliff. So the idea is that they're incredibly high up. These are women on the boards of directors of FTSE 100 companies. But they're taking on these leadership positions in times of crisis in some ways. Their share price is plummeting down. So the idea is that these women are up high, but they are perhaps teetering on the edge. It's risky, it's precarious. If you're leading in a time of crisis, it's not that easy to make things do well. You've got to turn this company around. You've got to increase the share price. Much harder than coming in when all is good, or when just things are just up and down as they normally are. So the idea then is that these leadership appointments are much more problematic. They're much more risky. They're much more precarious then. So we've got the experimental research, and because I'm an we've got the archival research, but because I'm an experimental social psychologist, the first thing I wanted to do is say, well, can I design an experimental study in the lab that gets to some of the underlying processes here, that explains what's going on in a much more controlled condition. So one of the questions that we had is there any evidence that women are preferentially selected for these leadership positions? We know that in the real world, in FTSE 100 companies, that they occupy them, but is it something about the selection process? Do people prefer women in times of crisis? So we conducted some experimental research to see whether we could find anything out here. To date, I think we've done about 25 studies. We get really similar patterns of results. It's been replicated in labs all over the world as well by research groups that are not my own. So instead of going through a series of studies, I guess what I'll essentially do is give you an overview of the sort of methodology that we use, and then at the end I'll give you some ideas of the sorts of samples and scenarios that we use. But what we generally do is we ask participants to be involved in a scenario-based study where we ask them to select a candidate for a leadership position when things are either going well or going badly. Now, what's going well and what's going badly differs depending on the study, but we generally have some sort of graph going up when things are going well, or some sort of graph going down when things are going badly. And then we say, look, we've got 3 shortlisted people for this position. You've got to decide who you want. So we give them CVs of 3 people. We give them some photographs, and we give them a little bit of a blurb about their experience and those sorts of things. What we're particularly interested in is candidate 1 and candidate 3, a man and a woman, equally qualified on all dimensions. And actually, you can see they're good leadership material. They're good looking, they wear glasses, I mean, clearly, really cut out for the job. And what's really important is essentially they're exactly the same. We take their CVs, we make them as identical as possible, and actually what we do is we counterbalance them. So every second person that fills out the questionnaire, we just mix them up. We just change the names and the photos over. So candidate 1, candidate 3, incredibly qualified for the job, equally qualified for the job. The only thing that differs is that one's a man and one's a woman. So we got poor old candidate 2 there. He was all right. He was a bit of a numpty, never going to get the job. He was just sort of in there to, you know, give a bit of realism as well. So the question then is, well, who do you want? Who do you prefer? Who do you prefer when things are going well, and who do you prefer when things are going badly? And we just ask them to rank your participants, rank those candidates. Who do you prefer? So when everything's going well, some sort of graph going up, what we find that him in the red bar, her in the purple bar, are pretty much preferred equally. He's got a slight advantage, but essentially their CVs are equal, they're equally qualified for the job, and that's pretty well represented in their rankings as well, when things are going well. But what about when things are going badly? What do we find? Almost exclusively her. almost 100% her. And in fact, sometimes they preferred the numpty in the middle rather than candidate one as well. So when things are going badly, they think she's fabulous. So we've demonstrated this in a whole lot of different scenarios. So we asked lawyers to choose a lead lawyer for a risky and a highly criticised case, and they chose her. We asked business leaders from the community to choose a financial director for a poorly performing company, and they chose her. We had some high school students come and visit the psychology department, and I said, I could do a glass cliff study on them. So I described them a music festival that was either increasing in popularity or decreasing in popularity, and when it was decreasing in popularity, they chose her. And we asked the average voter on the street to choose a political candidate to stand in a by-election in an unwinnable seat, and they choose her. So really different notions of leadership, really different notions of sort of crisis and precariousness, but a same pattern of results every time. They like her when things are going badly, however you define that. So hopefully, what I've shown you here then is that we've got archival research and we've got experimental research that shows that women, when they do break through the glass ceiling, when they do take on leadership positions, find themselves in rather risky and rather precarious positions. So if we're talking about the opt-out revolution, if we're talking about women reaching leadership, is this my mic that's making that noise? Don't know. But if you see these risky and precarious leadership positions, maybe that helps to explain why it is that women are opting out, why they're reaching these high things and saying, actually, not really sure that I like that, not really sure that I want to hang around. And in fact, if you do a study of the average tenure of CEOs in Fortune 500 companies, top 500 companies in the US, what you can see is that women are more likely to lead companies that are in crisis, that are doing badly, and also that while the average tenure of a male CEO is about 7.5 years, the average tenure of a female CEO is only about 2.5 years. So we've got women coming into leadership positions, but they're just not staying around. And unsurprisingly, if they're coming into positions that are risky, that are precarious, that are crisis-prone as well. So that's one strand of research. I want to move on to the second strand of research now, which is the gender pay gap. So the gender pay gap has been getting quite a lot of press, actually. There have just been some new details released as well. And I think, hopefully, everyone's sort of aware that the gap between men and women's pay generally is over 20%, often between 20 and 30%. But what you find is that even once you control for everything, if you control for education, if you control for type of job, part-time work versus full-time work, the gender pay gap is still around 18%. So for men and women doing exactly the same job, the pay gap tends to be about 18% or so. Now that varies a little bit across different places, but 15% across Europe in general, 18% in the Netherlands, where I do a lot of work actually, about 20% in the UK as well. But what's really interesting is that you might think that once you got up to the top echelons, once you got into really senior management, that wouldn't be so much of a problem. But actually it gets worse. The higher you climb the corporate ladder, the larger the pay gap gets. And so that if you look at top management positions in the UK, the gender pay gap, even once you match and control for everything else, is about 30%. It's depressing, isn't it? Doesn't make you want to opt out just about now. But anyway, let's have a look at this in terms of some of the evidence. Now, the economic literature suggests that managerial pay, so what we pay our top leaders, is very closely related to corporate performance. So the better a company tends to do, the more we tend to pay our leaders, especially and obviously for pay elements such as bonuses and incentives. And of course, there's been a lot of furor around this recently with bankers' bonuses and that sort of thing as well. But if you look at the psychological research, certainly the work into the romance of leadership by Meindl and his colleagues, it suggests that how we evaluate the performance of leaders is also very much related to issues of power and agency and performance as well. So if we've got these ideas about corporate performance and we've got power and agency, which all feed into pay and how we evaluate leaders, we also know that each of these processes, things to do around corporate performance, things to do with attributions of power and agency, are really very much related to gender. So evidence shows that men and women are evaluated very differently, even for doing exactly the same work, especially at work. The same action carried out by a woman is seen as less positive than when it was carried out by a man. And I think it's really important also that there are very different stereotypes that apply to men and women. While men are seen to be intrinsically powerful, they're able to affect change and make a difference, women are much more likely to be seen, rather than being agentic and powerful, as sort of warm and friendly. And in some ways we actually like women more, and we have a more positive stereotype of women, but it isn't one of affecting change and making a difference. So I guess one of the things that we wanted to do is have a look at how that might feed into and I guess contribute to pay and differences in pay as well. So this is work that I did with Clara Kulich, one of my PhD students from a little while ago. What we did was we described a company whose performance was either increasing or decreasing. Those graphs should start to look familiar to you by now. And what we said was there's either a male or a female CEO. Again, we gave them a little description of their CV and their role in the company and what they had done, matched on all dimensions. They're equally good looking. Well, not as good looking as our other people, but they've got glasses, so clearly leadership material as well. And we asked these participants, who were 201 professionals in the UK, to allocate a bonus. How much bonus are you going to give this CEO when things are going well or when things are going badly? And what we find is for a male CEO, when things are going well, they get a great big whapping bonus. When things are going bad, not so much. It's pretty clear cut, isn't it? It's performance-based pay. When performance goes up, their pay goes up. What about for women? So significantly different between these two, but for women, not quite so much. So on the one hand, when it's going badly, they get a bit more than he does, but when it's going well, they get much less. And actually, even though they look a little bit different, those lines are actually not statistically significant from each other. So one company is doing incredibly well, one company is doing incredibly badly, exactly the same statistically bonus that's there. And what we can do is we can replicate this when we look at the actual bonuses paid to senior management within UK companies. So there's an archive of this, there's a database, there's databases for all these things in economics, it's amazing. And what we can show just here is exactly the same pattern. So I'm not going to go into great detail, but what we can show is that across the bottom is return on assets, which is a measure of company performance. The blue line that you can see going straight up is men's bonuses. So as performance increases, their bonus just goes straight up. And you see the red line at the bottom there? Women's, dead flat. Doesn't matter how well a company does, don't get any more. What's really interesting is that there was no difference in the actual performance of companies of men and women. So it wasn't that women's companies did worse. Actually, women's companies did just as well. They just didn't get rewarded for it. They just didn't get the bonus for it. So I guess the summary here then is that company performance is positively related to male directors' bonuses, but not for females, and that women are just neither rewarded nor punished when things are going well or things are going badly. What we can take away from this is that men are seen to have agency. The things that they do matter. They affect things, they change things. They can make mistakes and things can go badly. They can do things well and things can go well. And they get rewarded accordingly. The fact that women's bonuses is just such a flat line sort of suggests that, well, we don't really think women can do anything. If things go well, it was probably due to something else. If things go badly, probably due to something else as well. So what's really interesting is not just that women get less of a bonus overall, but this interpretation that what they do doesn't really matter as well. So if we're talking about performance-based pay, the idea is that performance-based pay is a complete misnomer for women. It just doesn't really exist, especially at this director kind of level. And I think if we bring this into the idea of the opt-out revolution again, why it is that women aren't ambitious, why it is that women might get to particular leadership roles and opt out, maybe it's because they're not being rewarded in them. Maybe it's because what they do doesn't seem to matter, doesn't seem to be rewarded, doesn't seem to be punished either. Okay, so that was my second strand of research. Third strand of research then really looks much more directly at the idea of ambition. So I've talked, I guess, in some ways about two indirect reasons about why women might opt out of these senior leadership roles. One is because they might be actually more difficult, more precarious, more risky. The other one might also be that in these leadership roles, they might actually not get rewarded. They might not get the sort of pay and recognition that their male colleagues might do. But how does this relate to ambition? Or can we also look at ambition more directly? One of the things that we've been doing a lot of work with a number of organisations who have come to us to help explain why it is that women are dropping out of their organisations in greater numbers. So we've been working with the Royal College of Surgeons to find out why female surgical trainees drop out at twice the rate of male surgical trainees. We've been working with the Royal Navy to work out why, even though women are incredibly underrepresented at a much lower rate, they also drop out of the Navy at a much higher rate. We've been working with a number of police forces around the UK, looking at why women are more likely to drop out of police training as well. And what we've come up with from all of that research is really a theoretical model that looks at the experience and how experience might impact on this opting out and also on women's ambition and drive to make it to the top. So one of the things that we've really been emphasising and looking at is an idea of fit. So if you look at this hierarchy here, which is a really typical hierarchy in many different organisations, and particularly in male-dominated ones like surgery, like Navy, like the police force, is that at the bottom echelons you often get a mixture of men and women. But the higher you go up the ladder, the more, I guess, the fewer and fewer women that you have. So if men look to the top, look who's been successful, look at who has gone before them and succeeded, has done well, who are the leaders, they will see someone like them there. But for women, when they look up, they just don't have those same sort of role models. So our idea of fit, the way we define it, is the presence of others who are like you, who are similar to you, further up the career ladder, which gives you a sense of belonging, of fitting in, of identifying within that organisation. So while for men that might be more obvious, for women that might be less obvious. So let me just take you through a study that we've done with the Royal Navy that really looks at this idea of fitting in. And one of the reasons that I'm particularly interested in this is because of this idea of work-life balance. So if I go back to that quote that the woman gave in the New York Times magazine, it was this idea that I don't want that kind of life, I don't want to make those sacrifices, the baby provides a graceful exit. This comes up again and again when women are interviewed to say, why don't you go for partner in that law firm? Why don't you put yourself up for that senior management role? And they often say, well, I'm not so sure. I prefer a better work-life balance. Work-life balance is often seen as being really important for women. So how does work-life balance play into this? Well, certainly that we know that work-life balance is very much related to ambition in certain ways. And one of the reasons it's particularly interesting in the Navy is that traditional explanations of perceptions of work-life balance about this time, wanting enough time at home, enough time at work, and the solution to that is generally things like flexible working or going part-time or job sharing, and these are things that women take up at much higher rates than men. But if you're going out on a ship at sea for 3 or 4 months at a time, if you're stationed over in the Falklands, for example, you can't really do that job share, can't really do that part-time, can't really fix that up by looking at issues of time. But one of the things we also wanted to do is say, well, what else fits into a feeling like you have a good work-life balance? And I think one of those things is this idea of fitting in as well. So I'll present you some of this stuff from the Royal Navy as well. We had 422 employees on board ships, 89% men, which is very much indicative of the proportion of women on board. And we asked them about their work-life balance. Is their work-life balance with their personal life? And we asked them some of these key things that we're talking about in terms of the opt-out revolution. We asked them about their ambition, their motivation, but also their job satisfaction and their turnover intentions, whether they were just thinking about opting out. Then we asked them about time conflict. So how much time did they have to spend on their life outside of work? How much they fit in. I fit in with senior research Navy personnel. We asked them about their identification, whether they felt like they had strong ties and belonging with the Royal Navy. And we asked them about their work-life compatibility. Who I am at work is compatible with who I am outside of work. And what we found is that work-life balance was very strongly related to ambition. So the more that you felt like you had a good work-life balance, the more you expressed ambition to get ahead in your career, the more motivated you were to get ahead in your career, the more satisfied you were with your job, and also the less intentions you had to leave the organisation. Now, what was interesting is that a time conflict, like having enough time to do things outside of work, was certainly a predictor of work-life balance. But what was interesting is that just as an important predictor of whether you thought you had a good work-life balance and that you were ambitious, motivated, satisfied, and whether you wanted to leave or not, was actually fitting in. To the extent that you felt like people at the top, leaders within your organisation, were like you felt like you had a better work-life balance. So it wasn't just about time. Over and above time, this idea of feeling of fitting in and belonging really fed into perceptions of work-life balance. And this was partly because if you saw people who were like you, who were successful, that made you feel like who you were at home was compatible with who you are at work. Some sort of authenticity between who you were at home and who you are at work. And that was also in part explained by feeling like you belonged, like you identified in the Navy as well. So putting all of these things together, we've got this idea that having role models, having people who are successful like you, makes you feel like you fit in, makes you feel like you belong, makes you feel like you're authentic. And all of these things feed into having ambition, motivation, not wanting to leave your organisation as well. So I think what I've presented so far, I guess, is a really interesting sort of constellation of factors of this idea of fitting in and belonging. And I think what's really interesting, and I haven't put a slide in on this, is about who fits in. For this study on the Royal Navy, we had very few women there. It was very difficult for us to compare men and women, but we've done other studies. So we've done studies, as I was saying, with the police force, with the Royal College of Surgeons, and with a university in the southwest, which I'll leave unnamed, but with undergraduates studying science as well. And what we find is that for all of those groups, if you look at first-year undergraduate students studying science, first-year surgical trainees, or first-year police trainees, men and women have absolutely equal levels of ambition. They both want to get ahead, they both want to do well, they're both striving for the top. And that over time, for men, that ambition just goes up and up. Second year goes up, third year goes up, even higher. Surgical trainees, the same. Police force, the same. But for women, even though they start off with high levels of ambition, it goes down over time. So that by the third year of undergraduate studies, by the third year of police training, by the fourth or fifth year of surgical training, there are these huge gaps in ambition between men and women. But what we can do is that some people might say, well, isn't that sort of that's about when the biological clock just kicks in, isn't it? That over time women just suddenly get a bit broody, they want to stay at home, they want that graceful exit with the baby. But what's really interesting is that we're talking about women at really different times in their lives. Undergraduate science students are in their late teens, early 20s. Police trainees, mid-20s, mid to late 20s. Surgical trainees, mid-30s. So there's no map on there about some sort of time when suddenly this biological clock kicks in and suddenly you're not ambitious anymore. What is in common, though, is that you spend a couple of years within these sometimes quite masculine organisations or masculine environments, and what we can show from the surveys as well is that what completely maps this drop in ambition for women and this increase in ambition for men is feeling like they fit in. The longer that you're in training for men, the more they feel like they fit in. They look up, they see people like them who are successful, they feel like they fit in, they expect to succeed, and they're willing to make sacrifices to do so. But for women, you can see that absolutely drop over time. The more time you spend in surgical training, dealing with surgical consultants, the less women feel like they fit in. And therefore, the less ambitious they are. Sounds all a bit depressing, doesn't it? I'm sorry. But those are our three streams of research then. We've got the glass cliff, where women are in risky and precarious leadership positions. We've got the pay gap, where women aren't particularly rewarded for the work that they do. And we've got this lack of role models, which lead women to feel less ambitious, feel like they have less of a work-life balance, feel like they're less willing to make sacrifices, less likely that they will succeed as well. So hopefully, if I put all of those together, what I hope I've done is present you with 3 strands of research that suggest that women's experiences in the workplace can be quite different from their male counterparts. And hopefully what I've done is provide an alternative to the claims of this opt-out revolution just based on the fact that women are innately less ambitious. Hopefully what I've shown is that there might be reasons why they might be less ambitious, because the leadership positions that they get offered are difficult, are risky, and are precarious, that there's an increased risk of failure there, that even if they do succeed, they're unlikely to be rewarded for it in the same ways as their male counterparts, and that when they look up and see who has made it before them, there aren't people like them there. If you don't really expect to succeed, if you don't have role models that show that people like you have made it before, it's very difficult to put your hand up and say, see that thing over there that I'm unlikely to be able to achieve? I want that. It's much easier to say, see that thing over there that I'm unlikely to achieve? I don't want that thing. I think maybe the strongest of us would push against that and say, actually, I still do want that. But I think it's much easier to say, if someone is not going to allow you to have something, I don't want that thing. So when we hear those interviews from those women in the New York Times saying, I don't want that kind of life, is that just because they innately don't want it? Or is it because they think that they can't achieve it? So this idea of lower commitment and increased turnover may be a direct outcome of workplace practices around a lack of role models and subtle gender discrimination along the lines of the glass cliff and the gender pay gap as well. So just finally then, I think we often talk about the idea of equal opportunity and about gender equality, and a lot of the work that we do there is a lot about counting numbers. How many women do we have? How many female professors are there? How many women are there on the boards of Fortune 100 companies? So it's often about numbers and quantities. And hopefully what this research says is that it's not just about those things. It's about the nature of leaderships as well. It's about the quality of those experiences. It's about being rewarded for them as well. And I think if organisations were to prove that they were committed to offering women comparable leadership opportunities, rewarding them for them, and providing them with an expectation of success through successful role models as well, I think it's much more likely that women in turn would not be in an opt-out revolution, would instead be willing to make and retain their commitment to leadership within organisations. And I'll leave you with these fellas. Thanks. So if people do want to ask questions, I think we've got a number of roving mics here. So because we're recording this, we can't ask questions without mics, otherwise just the people won't be able to hear you. So if you do have any questions, just put up your hand and someone can come up with a mic and you can ask it. Or comments, or yeah, so there's one up there in the middle.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for your presentation. So I have a two-part question.
Yep.
The first is when you did the surveys after the archival work, so the experimental.
Yep, in the glass cliff work.
Right. So were there? Did you manage to do interviews with the women involved and ask them about their decisions to leave and what brought that about and what are the factors? Because you talked about fitting in later, and I was wondering what that entails exactly.
Yeah.
Is it maternity leave? Is it number of paid hours? Is it the environment, hostility, those factors?
Yeah.
The second thing is things like race and sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And how they play a part, if they come up at all, and
yeah, absolutely. Okay, can I take the second question first? Just because it's slightly easier. So if you look at this, actually you can't see that picture that well, but I mean, this is a picture that I said, look at all of these men in their glasses and suits. You know, this is the old boys club writ large, but they're not just boys, right? You know, we call them, I work with the Royal College of Surgeons, and they've got a great expression where they call them pale, male and stale. So they're all of a certain age. They're all white, they're probably all straight, they're probably from a certain background, they're certainly not disabled, all of these sorts of things. So I think the old boys club isn't just about boys, it is about, you know, these sorts of things. And actually, when we've done glass cliff work, we've shown that women are in these risky and precarious positions, but we can show exactly the same thing for race as well. So we did a study with women in politics, and we find that if you look at the general elections over the last 5 general elections, you can show that the Conservative Party, only the Conservative Party, runs women in safe Labor seats, essentially. So it's just like, look, we've got all these female candidates, and then they put them in safe Labor seats, and then they don't win. And if you just look at the polling data, you can say, well, Conservative women just poll terribly. They just don't do nearly as well. And you could easily, well, the Times could write an article saying women are hopeless at politics, we should never run them again. But we can completely explain that by the fact that they only run in safe Labor seats where they're never going to get seats anyway. And we can show exactly the same thing for black and minority ethnic candidates. The Conservatives will run them, not very many of them, they'll run some of them, but only in safe Labor seats. So exactly those same sorts of dynamics are playing themselves out. So I think what we see with the glass cliff is really just about not being part of this group. And we see it most often with gender because we do have women breaking through the glass ceiling, but I think we would find it on all of the protected characteristics. So your second question was about interviews. I don't really do interviews, so I like data. I do like talking to people, but I tend not to do that as part of my research. So I haven't done interviews, but we do have a bit of insight into some of the reasons why women leave that we haven't done through interviews, but we have done through other sorts of sources. And there is a big thing around expectations of success. You will stay, and it is, I'm doing a fellowship at the moment on work-life balance, being a really big decision maker for women in terms of the types of careers that they make and things like that. But what's really interesting, so if you look at the Royal College of Surgery and we say, well, why aren't there any women in surgery? There's only 8% of surgical consultants. And they'll all come to us, the pale, male and star ones, and they'll say, oh, but that's because women don't want to work those hours, unpredictable hours, late at night, long shifts. And I always say, nurses, midwives, these are women that work incredibly long hours, incredibly unpredictable. You've got to get called out in the middle of the night to deliver a baby. But it seems as if you get paid a lot of money and have a lot of prestige to do that, women are unwilling to do it. But if you pay them and undervalue them, sure, I'd do that, no worries. So I think it's really interesting that we talk about work-life balance, but is it something more complex than that? So I think work-life balance comes in a lot, and when we not interview these women, but when we survey them, that they do say that one of the big predictors of them wanting to go out is about their expectations of success and about their willingness to make sacrifices. This is a really interesting one as well, because we could say, well, that's just innate. Women aren't as willing to make sacrifices. That's exactly what Larry Summers said, isn't it? But part of the idea is, well, you're willing to make sacrifices if you think they're worth it, if you're going to get something out of it. If I'm not going to see my kids, I want to get paid well for it, perhaps, or at least be valued for what I do and feel like I can have a career there. But if you don't see those things, and you've got to balance that out with perhaps not seeing as much of your kids, are you willing to make the sacrifices? So I don't think a willingness to make sacrifices is a kind of innate thing. It's very much informed by our opportunities, by our role models, by our expectations of success. So does that explain it? Yeah. So, but I should do interviews. I mean, that would give us much richer data. I'm just not an interview kind of girl. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? There's one right up the back. Give you some exercise, Ben.
Hi. So in both of your experiments, or certainly the data you chose to share with us, you shared kind of two extremes, a good performing company and a poorly performing company. Yeah. What happens when it's steady state? Yeah. So in terms of the glass cliff? Yeah. Yeah, or I mean... Well, both, I mean... Or in terms of the pay gap as well? Yeah. Yeah. So I guess the experiment that we did was both, right? But for the pay gap, but the archival study looked at the whole range. So what you saw for men was a gradual sort of increase. So it's sort of, and so I guess steady state was somewhere in the middle, and they were kind of rewarded somewhere in the middle. But women, I mean, it's just flat the whole way. So certainly the archival work takes in not just the two extremes, but those are the big extremes. So when you do experimental work, it's just fun to play with, you know, big wowie numbers. But certainly the archival research suggests that that would lay somewhere in the middle. I guess if it's steady state, again, if we look at the archival research, for the glass cliff. I guess if you look at men's data, it sort of went up and down, which kind of is almost steady state as well. It wasn't going up, 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 or down, 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 down. It was sort of going up and down, which would be steady state, and we saw men in those positions. So I guess we can say that men are probably in the really good positions, in the kind of just ordinary positions, and then women are in the bad ones. So I guess that's how I would extrapolate from the archival data. But we didn't include a kind of middle of the road in our experimental work. We probably could have. A control condition or something, if you would. Yeah. And there's two just here in the middle.
Hi, yeah. So a lot of what you were talking about seems fairly ingrained into the way that things are working.
Yeah.
If we can, how can we go about changing this, especially the suppression of women's ambition, I guess, because that worries me a lot.
Yeah. So that's a really excellent question, because I think in some ways you could come to the end of that and say, oh, okay, well, we're doomed. What can we do? This is just the way it is. There's no point to it all. And I think, but absolutely, I'm much more positive than just saying, look, here are all the horrible things that happen to women. You may as well give up now. One of the things that we've been doing with the Royal College of Surgeons is to actually come up with an intervention to deal with this problem of a lack of fit, for example. So on the one hand, you might say, well, if only 8% of surgeons are women, you know, they just don't have those role models, what can we do? But partly we said, well, what sort of intervention do we do to maybe increase the visibility of role models for women? So one of the things that we thought, you know, there's lots of different ways in which you can do this. And one of the things that people often do is take the most senior woman, so the most senior female surgeon, and roll her out and say, look at her, she has done it. You can all do it too. And in some ways, you know, those women are incredibly inspiring. They're brilliant. But actually, they're often very unattainable. These are incredible people. And everyone just goes, I'm not really sure whether I could be like that. I don't know. I don't use Thatcher as an example for many things. But often people say, well, look, we had Thatcher. She was incredibly successful. That was the 80s. So the ceiling's broken. Anyone can do it. But I think a lot of women sort of go, well, I'm not Thatcher. I couldn't do that as well. So I think what we didn't want to do was just pick one incredible woman and roll her out and say, this is what you could do. So what we did instead was we created a vodcast, a video podcast kind of thing, where we interviewed a whole range of role models. So we had men and women of all sorts of different backgrounds, and this goes back to your question as well. So we had straight and gay, we had, you know, black and ethnic minority and white, we had some younger and we had some older, we had a refugee, we had a quite toffee-nosed, you know, upper class kind of thing, and we had a real working class sort of guy as well. So all different types, and we cut this all together into this kind of quite inspiring 17-minute vodcast. And I cry every time I see it because these people are just incredible. And I also cry because I think, why am I not a surgeon? Why am I an academic? And we play this, and I guess what the message that we wanted to bring out was not women have made it in surgery, you can make it, but we really wanted to get the message all types of people have made it in surgery. And we thought that would be much more inspiring. And actually, that can inspire a whole range of people. And so what we've been doing, we put this together, we've got a website on it, we go out to medical schools. So for men, and we know that there's 50% women in medical school, so trying to get them early before they decide to specialise. We also, first-year surgical trainees watch this as well, so trying to grab them before they drop out. So this is kind of a way in which we've tried to do this inspiration to try and deal with a lack of fit. So I think there's interventions that we definitely can do. We don't just have to say, there's a lack of fit, done. Glass cliff, not so easy, but we can play around with some of the stereotypes and some of the expectations that are there. So I think there was another question just in front as well, and then I can, yeah.
Hiya.
Hi.
First, I'm going to say thank you. That was a really interesting talk.
Great. Thank you.
And yeah, just my question is, so obviously your research is focused on factors within the world of work and how that's influenced women's ambition.
Yeah.
I wondered if you take into account, or whether there is a place to take into account external factors like societal pressures, and whether you think that plays a role, or to what extent that plays a role in shaping women's level of ambition.
Yeah, I mean, partly I would say that, you know, the world of work is part of society, so, you know, that's all together. But I guess you're saying, so are you saying things like work-life balance is about work and life, and so you've got to balance those two?
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, things like, so obviously the pay gap being a big factor in what women do, but then as opposed to factors kind of in the media, perhaps, or in shaping whether women feel like they should actually, it's time that they leave work, and it's time, like you're talking about, that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole lot of work that I haven't talked about here actually, which is around stereotypes. So it's about stereotypes about leaders, so what we think leaders should be like, what sort of traits and abilities they should have, and that's very much in the media as well. We see these big, powerful, ambitious men making big decisions. And then we have our stereotypes of what men and women are like. We've got big, strong men making decisions, you know, in the family, so even fathers and those sorts of things, and women not so much. And we can say that this is a think manager, think male association from which women are excluded. So there are a number of, and this is often used as a way of saying why women don't aspire to leadership positions, and also why other people don't pick them out as leaders, is because of this mismatch of these stereotypes. So I guess there's different ways in which we could fix that. One is we can change our stereotype of leaders, so it's not quite so blokey. The other way is actually to change some of our stereotypes around men and women so that they're not so different from each other. So I think, I'm not sure whether, you know, so the media presents men and women in particular ways as well, but also how we work at home. We've still got, if you've got a couple who are both working, a heterosexual couple who are both working, a woman's on average does 80% of the housework. So when you're in a society that's like that, where the media sells dishwashing detergent and things like that to women, you know, how do you move away from those sorts of stereotypes as well? And it does come down to some of the stereotypes I was talking to you about agency versus warmth, that really feed into how we evaluate the pay gap, for example. And we see that everywhere. And I put up, I think, a 50s housewife and Superman, which is, you know, two big polar extremes. But I think the media still facilitates exactly those sorts of things with Disney princesses versus Ninja Turtles and, you know, all of these sorts of, I've got a 6-year-old son, so it's all about Ninja Turtles at the moment. So yeah, I think absolutely, until we can sort of unpick some of these stereotypes, it's quite difficult. But I guess what I would say is that while it's difficult, and while it's really difficult to change the media or change our stereotypes, at least they are changeable. If we just go back to the idea that women are just innately less ambitious, there's nothing we can do about that. But if it is about our stereotypes and about our expectations, if it is about our role models and those sorts of things, at least, while difficult, those are things we can change. So that gives me some hope, at least. There's a question just here. I'm not sure how much time we have. Am I going into drinks time? That could be a disaster.
I have a few more questions.
Okay,
5 more minutes or so.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Sorry.
Hello, thank you very much for your really interesting talk.
Thank you.
I just wondered, in your research, whether you've taken into account certain disciplines of management. For example, I work in HR, and therefore it seemed as quite acceptable to be at the top of my profession in HR, because it's HR and everybody's female. But I wondered whether that, and also maybe different organisations, nationalities, for a Japanese organisation versus a UK organisation, does the research get affected by different countries?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really, really interesting. So I'll take the second part of the question first. So the cross-cultural kinds of things. So when you look at glass cliff work, if you look at Japan, when their companies are in crisis, they don't appoint a woman, they appoint a foreigner. So they usually get a US CEO to come in. So that's the same as this. I mean, you've got to flip it around, right? But if you've got an all-Japanese board and an all-Japanese company, you need to scapegoat someone in a terrible leadership position. Bring in an American. They'd be great for that, rather than bring in a woman. So I think there's some different nuances that are around those sorts of things. Now, the other thing is about what about in female-dominated professions and things like that. One of the things I would just say there is that there's this phenomenon called the glass escalator. I love metaphors. So, you know, the glass escalator. So we've got the glass ceiling, women can't get it beyond a certain point. The glass escalator says is that in female-dominated industries or sectors and things like that, like HR, for example, while there are fewer men that go into those areas, actually they're often accelerated up very quickly. So if you look at primary school teaching, hardly any men. If you look at head teachers of primary schools, almost exclusively men. So it's this really interesting thing. And I think while there are, you know, it's not unusual for a woman to be head of HR, it's not that unusual for a man to be head of HR either. But if you look at the statistics of all the people that are working in the HR department, actually it's statistically unusual as well. So I think there is something that women are more likely, obviously, where there is a critical mass of women coming through to do well.
but it's not the flip. The flip side doesn't happen. So I don't think that in more female-dominated arenas that men face glass cliffs. Actually, I think they get a little bit of a boost. Yeah? Okay, was there someone just behind you? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, did you personally ever have someone in your life that acted as a role model for you in getting you where you are today?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm glad you really... So I don't know whether you saw right at the beginning, I said these are my collaborators, and the first collaborator was Alex Haslam, who was absolutely, or still is, my absolute role model and mentor and things like that. So I think one of the things that underlines is that a mentor and a role model doesn't have to be a woman for a woman. One of the things that he really taught me was that he had a good work-life balance. So he worked incredibly hard, incredibly successful professor, and he worked 9 to 5, and he worked incredibly hard, and he never worked evenings and weekends, and he never expected me to do that either. So I've never worked evenings and weekends either. So I've just had this fabulous work-life balance. But he also taught me to be incredibly strategic and incredibly sort of, have a plan and have an idea, and just really encouraged me and gave me that confidence. So I think for me that was a really big part of that, just to have someone to encourage you to do that, and that it wasn't necessarily a woman. Although the other side of that is that I also had a female professor that worked in my department that had 2 children, and I saw her balance those two as well, to be a really good mum and to be a really good academic. And that made me see that you could do both of those at the same time, I guess. And that's always really good to see. Because actually Alex had no children, so he managed to have a really good work-life balance but not have children. So I think often, I don't think any one person should just have one role model or mentor. It's really good to have a different range of people that you can look to, for example. Yeah. I think there's one over here.
Sorry. Hamzi?
Thank you. I'm a law student. I've gone to lots of presentations this year, and loads of the law firms, especially the corporate law firms, have come down and have really emphasised their female training programmes and all the support they give to female trainees to try and get them into those higher level jobs. Do you think that these kind of programs are effective enough, or do you think there needs to be like a wider shift in society to try and increase that female participation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it will partly depend on what hat that I have on. So if I have my consultancy hat on, where a law firm asked me to come in and deliver leadership training for women, then I'd say absolutely, that's the way to go, and this is my invoice. But if you ask and I do believe, I think we deliver good things and all of those sorts of things. But I guess the feminist political side of me says, why should we change women? Why should we say, here are all the skills and abilities that we need to give you as if there's something wrong with you? And now I think the reality is that women actually are often faced with different barriers, different workplace experiences, and that you can give them and equip them with the ability to deal with those. But I don't think we need to teach women how to do leadership. They're completely capable of doing leadership or negotiating or having difficult conversations or law or all of those things. I think what would be better is if we had a training course for, I'm not going to say men, but for society more generally, to get rid of some of the stereotypes and the barriers and those sorts of things there. So I think we sort of need a balance in some ways. I think women who are approaching leadership roles feel like they need something else to equip them to deal with it. But I really worry, and I don't want to perpetuate the idea that women need extra and something special because they're somehow deficient. So I think we need to get that balance right. But if there's any law firms in the area that need consultants, then I'm happy to do that. So I don't know whether that answers your question.
It does, yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, okay, so thanks very much. Those are really, really interesting questions, so I really appreciate sort of the feedback and the dialogue and all of those things, and I think Ben will probably give you the details of where there might be drinks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to quickly say, again, can we put our hands together for an absolutely brilliant presentation? It was, I hope it was for many of you as inspiring as it was for me. I mean, it's great to see this research in action as well. As promised, I've been informed that there are now drinks up on kind of the patio a bit outside the back, so please do take the opportunity to have it's a seasonal theme, so seasonal drinks, mulled wine, but also the chance to talk to each other, but also Michelle. And I would also encourage you to check out the Research Uncovered website, where this lecture will soon be going up, but also details of our series happening throughout next term, with hopefully lots more very inspiring research and ideas to really consider. So thank you very much for coming this evening, and I hope you have a wonderful Christmas. Thank you.